what we have been dealing with now, really, over this last month, were the indications of the presence and the activities on this continent, and particularly in the territory of the United States, of the esoteric tradition. And in that respect, I think we mentioned that obviously there were older traditions here, and I don't know whether I brought that up, but I think it was James Madison who actually copied the proceedings of the Iroquois Federation. It was the Federation of the Iroquois tribes, the way they had their great meetings, and used that as a model for the first sessions of the Congress of the United States. So definitely there was some, whatever one wants to call it, some carryover from some of the earlier civilizations which existed here. But probably at that moment, probably not too many. But in any event, what we need to look forward now to, all right, so who will be the guardians of the future? And when I listen to my radio, which is my principal ear to the outer world, I haven't looked at television in about 2 years or so. So, in any event, we need to keep in mind that, of course, within this particular world of manifestation, the time allocations of past, present, and future are always present, although one of the Gnostic scriptures says that time is a counterfeit of eternity, which, if you kind of look at it psychologically, which is my way, then it makes a good deal of sense. You say, oh yes, this is just like when something goes on and on, but in this case it is such and such. So it is something modeled on eternity, but it is not eternal in nature. So that's a kind of a useful appellation. And at the present time, let's say where time has brought us now, the current condition of our nation is a strange one. I think that with the many, many decades that I spent here, that this past year and the present time perhaps have been the most eloquent manifestations of confusion that I have seen. And so we are in that, and we must keep in mind, however, that while none of us like being confused or being in a confusing period of history, there can be beneficial results of the same. For instance, in the transformation process of alchemy, which is a very, very important symbolic and metaphorical system, really, of human psychological transformation, there are indications of confusion. There is a period in alchemical transformation that is referred to in Latin as massa confusa, the confused mass. So this is when the different elements are all commingled, and there is there is no seeming rhyme or reason for things, and then it takes a period of development, in fact a period of time, until they sort themselves out, and then you go into the various alchemical phases of transformation, like the black phase, the white phase, the yellow phase, and the red phase. So the transformation can only take place after an initial confusion, because unlike the confusion in our own consciousness, when the cosmos has its confused and confusing times, something comes out of it. In other words, the confusion does not last. From the confusion there develops something important and something that we need to pay attention to, which is not really the truth with human affairs and human politics. As you can see, the more activity there is, the more confusing things get. But that is not the case on the larger perspective. So as the Hollywood prophet, whom probably none of you have seen, and was an important figure on television, had a national program, man by the name of Criswell, whose program was once or twice a week, Criswell Predicts. And he was a fabulous character. He had this dark scene where he sat in front of a darkened table, and then he would start, tomorrow, tomorrow, and tomorrow, here today and gone tomorrow, and this Criswell predicts. And then he would make the most astonishing predictions, which of course never came to pass, but which were of interest to quite a few people. I watched many of them. Then later on, I acquired a sort of remotely personal relationship, because my distant relatives, who have as one of their sons my dear friend and cousin Charles, the Coulomb family lived in the house on Las Palmas Boulevard that Criswell lived in, that Criswell owned. And so he knows wonderful stories about Criswell. But let us say the concern with the future is always a difficult one. Predictions of the future are more often false than not, and so there are all kinds of problems with the future. I think there was some important sport figure, I don't know, Roberta remembers it, she's my memory now, who referred to the future in very derogatory terms also. So let's say, I think he indicated that the future is, it's very difficult to predict, especially the future. Very, very nice expression. In any event, so that is not really our concern. At this particular time, I just would throw out a few thoughts for our consideration, indicating as we put in our flyer, who will be the guardians of the future. Because we have indicated in our review of the past that there were various manifestations of the esoteric tradition, and that they really were the guardians of historical development. and this cannot be denied, and they were, for the most part, all inspired by the esoteric tradition. So if we knew who, if we can ask and give a reasonable answer to who were the guardians of the past, then we might reach some conclusions as to who will be the guardians of the future. And what, of course, we need to keep in mind, and in the present curious period of history that is not easy to keep clear, that the guardians of the past whom we are referring to were all, to a greater or lesser extent, spiritual guardians. That even as the human being consists, according to various classifications of an esoteric nature, consists of body, soul, and spirit, so the cosmic units, such as the world upon which we live, are also similarly constructed. And therefore, what history is derived from is the spirit of humanity. And maybe some additions. I wouldn't be surprised if the spirit of the nicer subspecies of dogs should fit in there. And I have always had a great liking for dogs, and I still do. And so undoubtedly there are various psychic and spiritual influences, but we need to consider as to what over in terms of the spiritual foundations of this period and of the coming period also of history, it's important for us to try to see as to what kind of influences, what kind of guidance, in this case, of a nature that is of interest to it for us from an esoteric point of view took place. And so if we look as to who were the guardians of the past in a spiritual sense, obviously, initially, and on the largest field of endeavor, we need to take a look at the religious influences, the religious activities that took place subsequent to the conquest of the North American continent. And so we need to first of all keep in mind that while certainly many unique characteristics can be discovered, that probably one of the most monumental unique characteristics of the newly found United States was a very, very wide form of religious freedom that just didn't exist anywhere else. You went to Germany, well, after the Reformation, the state religion was and still is Lutheranism. You went to most of the European countries had their own state religion. Of course, the state religion of Great Britain being the Anglican Church, the Church of England, COE, and therefore the kind of plurality that came about and functioned and is still sort of limping along in its functioning in the United States of mainstream religious denominations, their plurality was not really known anywhere in the world. to this day, if you go to about half of the countries of the world, in the Middle East and Africa and so forth, they are Muslim. And the Muslims are never terribly friendly toward other religions, because they have interpreted their Quranic sayings of the Prophet to the extent that he and his tradition are the only ones, which I have read the Quran in various interpretations, I have taught it. My feeling is that that is an exaggeration. But Muhammad was a very intelligent man, in addition to being an inspired man, and he had no desire to obliterate other spiritual traditions. Rather, he wanted to learn from them, and in many respects he did. But in any event, whatever that case may be, to the United States came a number of religious denominations, major ones and minor ones, and many of these were their coming and their activities, their flourishing here, were the result of that religious freedom that was accorded. Because otherwise the state religion would have been a Church of England, which then would have become a Church of America. Wouldn't that have been a nice expression? But in any event, inasmuch as this spectacularly wide religious freedom was accorded, we found in fairly short order number of religious groups, the overwhelming majority of them of the Protestant kind, because that was the time when Christendom in many places had adopted the faith of the Reformation, and so there were, in fairly short order, there were numerous Protestant churches in the country, which we often refer to as the mainstream churches, such as the Episcopal Church, the Baptist Church, Methodist churches, Presbyterian Church, and Roman Catholicism, which entered with Lord Baltimore and founded Maryland. Maryland is a pretty Catholic name. It's not anybody else's but Mary's. And these, let's say, had probably the greatest influence on the psyche, on the American psyche. Of course, as the immigrations went on, there were more, like with the Irish immigration, which would have been primarily sort of in the latter part of the 19th century, when the potato famine and various other things drove the Irish out of Ireland. That brought in a lot of Roman Catholicism, and then with the immigration of people from sometimes later from Italy, to a very great extent, also Roman Catholic, and then from the Slavic nations, primarily Slavic and Middle Eastern nations, primarily the Orthodox churches. Now, this would provide the populace with something, a permanent foundation of a transcendental orientation, a religious mind, and a consequent, if we accept that proposition, a consequent psychological strength. I think that a very good case can be made that peoples, whether large or small, who have a strong practice and conviction that we might call religious, have a more solid worldview and are usually able to have a certain psychological strength that others don't have. Now, why that is, I don't think I would be able to delineate completely, but I think primarily because as modern psychology, particularly of C.G. Jung, I think has discovered in a very powerful way that the spiritual orientation, the cultivation of what he called the transcendent function, which all has been practiced by various religions, is an extremely important human activity. Human beings who have an orientation to transcendence, and as he even mentioned later on in his life, that along with the psychological functions of the ego, of the sensation and feeling and thinking and intuition, there is a transcendent function. And this transcendent function is the one that derives its strength from spirituality, from religion, and that is sort of what we are taking a look at, because we are trying to discern as to what were the really spiritual foundations, the transcendentally oriented foundations from the early times on in the United States. Now, this being the case, we need to keep in mind that from a very early time, and some of our talks here in this month were devoted to that, obviously there was also a sort of sub rosa, which is an old expression, under the rose, because when the medieval codices were written, apparently one of the, at a certain period of time, one of the ways of concealing statements that they didn't want to come out with very strongly, very forcefully, was to paint a rose on the page and then hide that particular sentence behind the rose. And that is sub rosa, under the rose, which is kind of interesting, a little horticultural insight into the Middle Ages. But in any event, so somewhat in that way, somewhat under the rose, and in various other partially disguised forms. These were sort of the ones that I just mentioned, these Christian and mainly Protestant denominations are the ones who supplied the people of the United States, irrespective of their particular ethnicity, supplied them with a certain religious, spiritual foundation, so that a generally present belief systems and moral systems were present, which were mostly compatible with each other, and which supplied the country as it developed with a certain foundation. The foundation this kind of foundation, which you find, of course, if you study the history of religions in various places of the world, it usually consists of two great factors. And I like to sort of liken them to the two frontal pillars in the biblical legend of the Temple of Solomon, Boaz and Jachin. Those are not pillars that hold up the temple, but they are decorative pillars with spiritual meaning that stand in the front of the Temple of Solomon. And they have certain, Freemasonry had concentrated on their symbolism that really is quite interesting. So you might say that in every spiritual tradition will have at its very basic foundation what the French like to call au fond. The fond is the floor in this case. So from the floor on, these are the important considerations. A few years ago, I wouldn't have bothered to enumerate them because these foundations were still so strong in the American psyche that it was natural that they were there. But since then, I'm afraid there have been important changes which have brought about a different situation. Now, the important factors there are two things. One is a cosmological foundation of which becomes the foundation of the thinking of a people and of a culture. Now, what do I mean by cosmological? It's the sort of thing that is based on a creation myth. Who created the world? How was the world created? And various other legendary but still very important material that accedes to that. And this gives the people who are within that religious thinking, this gives them a general feeling and a feeling-toned knowledge of where they're coming from. Who created us? Because somehow it's just difficult for people to think that they were not created by anyone. Although, let's see, with the Darwinian evolution and so forth, of course, that became more of a possibility. So let's say this compound religious background of these various Christian churches had supplied the American people with a cosmology, a way to understand the environment wherein we live and to understand it in a more or less spiritual fashion. And this in say, even a few decades ago when I came to this country, was very much there. And I was surprised in Europe already, where, to our great delight, occasionally we came across an actual dollar bill. You know, they were very, especially the single dollar bills, were very, very expensive. If you got a single dollar bill, you could buy all kinds of things. With a $2 bill, a little bit. $5 and $10 and so were too high a denomination. So that's how we lived. So I immediately looked at the symbolism of the designs, the pyramids and things on the dollar bills and so, and I came to the conclusion that it's a sort of a whole cosmology. I'll come back to that word, which often is used maybe in a somewhat different context, but I know at least of one philosopher, the late and great Gerald Hurd, a very, very, very great, wonderful thinker, who used that quite a bit. So that's that everybody needs to have, no matter how small or how elaborate, a cosmology, a way that a person apprehends and understands the world and her position within it. That is our orientation. If we don't have some kind of a cosmology, then we are very, very on very, very shaky ground. But if we have some of that, and people like Galileo, Copernicus, and all these various people who really came to change the cosmology of Western Christendom, and they changed it in a way which conformed to the observational data of the cosmos. So that they did an important thing. If you go to, and then the people who built on that, if you go to Rome, you go to the Campo di Fiore, which is the place of flowers, because that's where the flower markets of Rome were always there. I think to this day, on certain days, when you want to buy flowers, you go to the Campo di Fiore, and vast number of flowers there. Also, large flocks of somewhat annoying pigeons, which are everywhere. In any event, that is where many of the developments. That is where Giordano Bruno was executed by the Inquisition because he taught a cosmology that was based on Copernicus, and Copernicus was a Pole, by the way, Polish. His Polish name is something like Koperniczki. But in those days, everybody who, especially if they were of a scholarly occupation, they gave themselves a Latin name. They changed their name around to a Latin format. So in any event, so when we take a look at these folk, then we see that they tried to cobble together a cosmology which, according to their scientific view, which was based largely on observation and on ways of understanding their observations, that this became eventually the worldview, the Weltanschauung, as we call it in German, of the Western world. But behind it lurks the cosmology of the Old Testament, because of what Christianity inherited from Judaism, and then what in turn Judaism and Christianity passed on to their various descendants, various sects and so forth. So let's say there existed for a very long time, I would say at least a millennium and a half, if not more, maybe more like 2 millenniums and then some, of a kind of underlying thought structure of Western culture that was based on the notion of a creation with a creator, and of an orderly cosmos wherein certain cosmic laws were instituted by who knows who, but they were there. So that when you study your environment, which is the world, you see a certain orderly picture there, which allows you to get the idea, whether rightly or wrongly, of living in a more or less orderly and therefore probably reliable world. Because a world that has its own laws, that has its own rules. And this is then also transferred to the human. Because the human, in turn, being a little cosmos himself, herself, itself, I don't know how many genders do we have to invent now, but I am game in any event. The human being itself wants it on its own, wants a functioning internal cosmos. And I'm not talking about the physical, the heart and the brains and the nervous system or so, although even that reflects that to some extent. So we are a species that desires order. Although if you came to look at some of our apartments or our kitchens, and certainly my bedroom, you will find very little evidence of the inhabitants having been so desirous of order. But still, you know, if things get too disorderly, the human psyche becomes disorderly itself. It begins to mirror the disorder in the environment, and that, of course, has all kinds of unsalutary results. So that is why we had, let's say, pretty soon after the pilgrims and various other immigrants from the early times came to this country, we begin to, in America, we begin to experience both the good of that kind of inherited world picture based on the Bible, based on Christianity, and on the other hand, strange and unhappy things came out of it, such as the persecution of the witches, which was which. You know, it's always important to remember which is which. In any event, was obviously brought over from Europe, from England, where the witch craze and the witch persecutions were at their height. It was a particular kind of a malign wave that swept over much of Europe, except one country, at least one country that I know, and that was Hungary. There was never a witch trial or anything about the witches, because sometime earlier, one of our early kings, King Koloman the Wise, passed a law, and the king's word was law, and we had to learn it in Latin. De strigis qui non sunt nulla mentio fuit. The witches who do not exist shall not be mentioned in our kingdom. So they were never mentioned, not in a positive or in a negative fashion, and that doesn't mean that some of the less pleasant elderly ladies in a village were not referred to as, oh, that old witch, but you know, there was certainly no witch persecution, and so witchery was just not part of the public scene. It's kind of interesting, but it also shows that the Hungarians were so reverent for the kings, the successors of Saint Stephan, the wearers of the Holy Crown. And so once a king passed a law like that, it usually maintains itself. So in any event, we didn't have any witches, but the witch cult, the persecution of the witches, and I read a lot of literature on it. In fact, if you look at some of my books, you might think that I am one myself, but trying to figure out whether the various things that have been written, particularly beginning since the early 1960s or late 1950s, whether these were based on any actual historical observation or not. And I even corresponded with Dr. Gerald Gardner, who was the reviver of witchcraft in England, of the Wicca tradition. Seemed like a very nice gentleman, and he sent me a black-handled witch's knife, an atami, which somewhere among all my books and other things must be hidden away. In any event, he was an interesting man and a learned man, and of course the great prophet of this of the whole idea that in prehistoric times there was a sort of nature cult all over Europe, and that the remnant of that was witchcraft, and that it was the chief deity being a feminine deity, but also having the man with the horns, with the antlers, as its husband, and that this was really the prevailing primeval religion all over Europe. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. I think a fairly convincing case was made by some of the scholars, particularly Margaret Murray of London University, who was really the one who started this whole witchery, on the scholarly level. But how true their conclusions were, undoubtedly was there there is no noise without a source of the noise. So undoubtedly there was something there, but maybe not exactly what the scholars designed. So in any event, however, the witch persecution very much caught on, and some of the early Stuart kings, and others were quite a bit in favor of persecuting the witches, and that in turn often caused dissatisfaction with them. But I see in other, yes, there was quite a bit of witch persecution in various parts of Germany, France, not so much in the Slavic countries, so we don't really need all the details, but let's say the witchery had come over to the American continent, and also the enemies of the witches. So instead of having witch finders, it was like a class of whistleblowers in England. Instead of those witch finders, you found the fanatical anti-witch preachers in the United States. But no matter what you may read, while in Europe the mode of execution of the witches was primarily by fire, witch burning, in America that was not the case. So there were no witches burned in America. If you want to feel guilty about that, then don't feel guilty. But what there were hung on trees. That was the American method. And of course the instigators and the judges and the big mouths were what? Were the Protestant preachers. Initially, I didn't mention the congregational which preachers and so forth. And so it's a very... It's really a very dark period of American history. Certainly not all the ministers in the country were witch persecutors, but some were, and it really gave America and American religion a bad name. But of course, it was eventually done away with, and so that was no longer the problem, although there were denominational conflicts, but not anything as terrible as we had in Europe, where you had the 30-year war, which was a war of religion, Protestants and Catholics against each other, and many other things. But let's say, so that certainly the witch persecution and various other actions of fanaticism like that were the shadow side of Protestant America. You know, the Catholics didn't burn any witches, at least not here. But now what we need to keep in mind that nevertheless, let's say, probably with the, and this is just sort of a wild idea of mine, probably with the presence and the persecution of the witches in America, there also came a spirit of rebelliousness against religious orthodoxy, whatever the religious orthodoxy happened to be. Because I know how that is when you have, just like we were Catholic people, my family, Catholic way back for hundreds of years, but we and many of our friends were extremely upset, more so perhaps than a lot of other people, over the persecution of the Jews. I have one of the very few times when I saw my father cry when they came to take away the 2 Jewish families in our immediate neighborhood. And we said that we should be ashamed of ourselves to not being able to do anything about it. But of course, that was easier said than done. In any event, so things of that sort we did go through. But let us say that the reason I brought much of this up to begin with is that a culture, such as the Christian culture of Europe, which subsequently became the transplanted Christian culture of America, that these are an important thing, because they give the humans who are there, give their psyches a certain definite safeguards to function by, and certain belief systems with their own moral aspect. In other words, all over history and all over the world, then or now, when you look at religion, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, among other things, and I know that's inconvenient very often, I certainly have found it inconvenient early in my life, that you have a set of rules, and that if you don't follow those rules, well, if people find out about it, they might punish you. But the biggest thing is that somebody else might punish you. And so a situation develops where human conduct is at least to a certain extent motivated by rules which in turn engender fear. Now, I am not making excuses for it, but I would say that if I had a great sum of money and nothing else, I would venture to bet that, if one could do that, such a thing, I would bet that the absence of the Ten Commandments of Christianity or in Judaism, of course, would have created great social difficulties from the early Christian times on, through the Middle Ages, through the modern age and later, because that is how humans are constructed, that you can tell them 1,000,000 times that something ought not to be done. But if you tell them this ought not to be done, and if you do it, you're going to be punished, then they're not going to do it. It's just the way we are made out. And then again, of course, there may be the really adventurous among us to say, well, why do they want to stop me for doing that? I'm going to try it. Let's see what happens. That happens too. And it's really a little more fun that way. But one has to keep it in mind. In any event, so I think the worst of this, the tyrannical side of Christianity that came over to the Americas, manifested in the witch persecutions. But of course, eventually that was over too, and so meanwhile, while all of this was going on, people got away from witch persecution. People changed from one sect to another, the different historical periods, all this sort of thing that went back and forth, also created a curious phenomenon, which I have certainly not witnessed anywhere else, but then I haven't been everywhere. I have only been to, was raised in Europe. I've been to what used to be called Australasia, namely Australia and New Zealand and so forth. But these are really all the offspring of European Christianity. But let's say the pluralism in religious terms, really continued in America. And if you go, I haven't been there now for many years, but I remember when I had the time and on a lark, as they call it, although there were no birds around, I went with a friend of mine to the deepest area of Mississippi, to a little town called Corinth, Mississippi, where we stayed for a couple of weeks. And I found out when we drove into Corinth, is just a small town, probably less than 1,000 inhabitants. But we drove around, and on every street, I'm not kidding, on every street corner there was not a gas station, but a church. And they were usually all First Baptist Church, Second Baptist Church, Third Baptist Church, Fourth Baptist Church. There they were, all of them, And I didn't go to any of them while I was there, by the way. I thought, I'm my own preacher. But in any event, I could see that the religious life of these really rather simple people who all for the most part, very much impoverished since the Civil War, badly handled and things like that, that their reliance on the Bible, on certain fundamentals of Christianity was very, very great. And so I found it also in other places, Texas and so forth. So let's say the impact of Protestant Christianity with its particular worldview and its codes of behavior was very important in early America, and I would say even at about the times when I came to this country in the early 1950s, people were very observant of religious doctrine and of religious rules. And so one could tell that at the foundation of the American psyche there was a great deal of this biblical and maybe even Old Testamentary Christianity, and that on the whole it agreed with the populace and kept, when you got some kind of a structure structure for behavior, structure for your thinking that works for you, that is good. That is good. And to do away with that and to lose it, on the other hand, is the opposite of good, which is bad. So in these many years that I have been here and observing the scene, and then of course I became a teacher of religion myself and so forth, I came to see that somehow the mind of, if I can use that, the psyche of the culture was moving away from its spiritual foundations of yesteryear, and there did not seem to be much moving into its place. Oh yeah, now then there was the so-called New Age, which those of us who like to make fun used to pronounce the New Age. The New Age. So if you want to make fun of some of those dear people, then they say, oh, are you one of those New Age people? I think that you're not going to gain any friends that way, but it might be interesting, nevertheless. And then, of course, very strongly commingled with subsequent developments like the New Age, there was the, how should we put it, the sublinear presence in various ways of the esoteric tradition. It's curious. I think there are certain parts, especially of the United States, the Hudson Valley being one. If you ever go up that way, just drive around, move around, and you will feel that there is something strange going on in there. Well, a lot of strange things have been going on, and going clear back to the time of George Washington and before. The unusual people, the strange people, especially those who are in unusual spiritual matters and so forth, always found themselves sooner or later in the Hudson Valley. And I had the privilege because of the presence there of a theosophical retreat center, that, forget you this now, for 30 years, at least once a year, I was always in the Hudson Valley with the Theosophists. And I tell you what, I enjoyed myself immensely. It was really nice people, very smart people, and the whole atmosphere around there, it must have always been thus. There is something there that stimulates that side of the psyche. And so in any event, and that was, and I'm not the only one saying so, if you read Mitch Horowitz's Modern Occultism, for instance, which I think is a very good historical work, he points out that the Hudson Valley mysticism was really the foundation of practically all heterodox religious or spiritual thought in the United States for several hundred years. Now, sure, there are examples that are different. For instance, the spiritualist movement, which in the early middle part of the 1848 of the 19th century came to the fore, did not start in the Hudson Valley. It started in the Midwest. But of course, pretty soon the Hudson Valley was all full of mediums. Yeah. So in any event, there's a lot of very interesting things came from them. Almost every different religious, spiritual movement from the spiritualists, from other trance, altered consciousness type of people, all the way down to later times and to our times, they all of them at one point or the other lived and functioned in that area. It's very strange, but it is there, and I can, if one isn't too afraid of just blowing smoke, but I must say that, and I traveled on it up and down all the way from Albany, where we used to originally come, because Albany has a great big airport. Why? Because that's the state capital. So all the politicians want to travel in nice airplanes. And there was some good publishing companies there and various other things. But let's say a sort of quasi-religious, spiritually oriented avant-garde seemed to always come and concentrate itself in the Hudson Valley. Even the founder of one of the truly great worldwide religions of American origin, the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, had his early career in the Hudson Valley, Joseph Smith. Yeah. And so no wonder I considered that I should settle there and become a new prophet. But I thought that California was more fun. Oh, how wrong I was, at least by now. However, that is all neither, as it were, neither here nor there. But there certainly, even to the present time, for instance, that's just to indicate how these things go on. The most powerful and possibly the most creative religious movements within the Roman Catholic Church, which of course I observe always, the Divine Mercy movement has its greatest center, its greatest activities in the Hudson Valley, where a magnificent shrine of the Divine Mercy. And it's not something to ignore, because I think this is one of the most important religious movements within the Roman Catholic Church, bar none. And if it succeeds as it seems to, I think it's going to have very good, very salutary effects. So now, but everything, Christian Science, a New Thought movement, every doggone thing, if you trace them back sort of to their origins, somewhere around there. It's really very interesting. But if you also have a good imagination, then you can actually feel something around there. There is a spiritual sparkle in the air, which is interesting and which is stimulating. So all hail for the Hudson Valley. And it is, of course, there also that quite a few German immigrants came out way early in the time of the American Revolution. And a good many of them were real old-fashioned Rosicrucians. And the towns are there, the places are there, and even some of the people are still there. So that is really an interesting circumstance. If one were the great clairvoyant of the ages, I don't know, New Edgar Casey or something, you could go there and pick up the vibrations, and you could see as to how long these strange ecstatic sects and their leaders and their preachers and so were active there. And I think it would be surprising because there was a great deal of activity, more and more people coming in. Originally Quakers and Shakers, especially the Shakers, and interestingly enough the majority, not all, but the majority of these movements usually were led by women. Way back in the George Washington's time, that's unusual, really unusual. So it was a sort of a breeding ground of various varieties of feminine spirituality. Now, why did I bring all this up and took up the whole morning? Well, I think one of them being that if indeed we or others who are consider ourselves as being within the esoteric tradition want to make an imprint, want to do something good, then we should consider, let's say, doing something similar to what the Hudson Valley mystics did in the past. That the time is here to really turn toward the spirit. And that is going to be very difficult because, as we know in the openly available culture, the frequently uttered saying nowadays is, "Oh, I am spiritual, but not religious." Which again is I think, an attempted way out of a predicament, which doesn't really take you out of the predicament. Because at least one thing we should have learned from the psychedelic movement, for instance, a few decades ago. And what is that? That spiritual movements, religious movements start with altered state of experience. Altered states of experiences can come about in various settings. And sometimes they may be connected with things that people ingest, at least at times, and sometimes not. But an altered state of experience has to be there. Everybody from Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, to Mary Baker Eddy and people like that, they were people who had visions, they had people who had unusual experiences themselves, and on these experiences they built their spiritual movements. So the overwhelming majority of, should we say, mildly heterodox spiritual movements, sometimes not even so mildly, that we have in the United States, started somewhere with one or more people having unusual psychic experiences and then building various doctrines, mythologies, and heaven knows what else on these experiences and cultivating that kind of experience. Now, this is what we need to remember. And I think a lot of people in the esoteric tradition fail to remember it. It was my big argument with my theosophical brethren and sisters in the past that what they were devoted to, and very, very effectively and very nicely, isn't it? If it hadn't been for the devotion of those old ladies and gentlemen that I encountered here a long time ago, we wouldn't have this building to meet in. They are the ones who did it. So really very wonderful, interested and devoted people, but what they were striving for was primarily and almost exclusively a worldview, a doctrinal situation. Reincarnation, karma, masters, maybe mistresses too, I don't know, but things like that. And the thing is, and here I was a youngster in my early 20s, and here I stood in the middle of this room arguing with them. I said, if Madame Blavatsky were here, she would give you hell. I used that very expression, because this is not what she wanted. All right, so do you know what she wanted? Well, I'm working on it. I maybe don't know it yet. By now I think I know a little more. But this is the problem, that we are all raised in some kind of a religious background, milieu, even if it was just in early childhood. And that in turn implies a structured worldview. And so when people come up with new religious movements, that's what they create also at first. And to some extent that is all right, because I think that a structure, a meaningful universe, behind which there lurks a transcendental meaning. A meaningful universe is extremely important for one's spiritual life. But your spiritual life should not stop with that. You can have wonderful, meaningful worldviews and so forth. Everything explained to the last moment by karma or something else, or even if it's along the scientific lines. But then you can ask yourself, then what? Then what? All right, so I believe in the Mahatmas, so I believe in angels, so I believe in this and that. Believe, believe, believe. The question is, you believe, but what do you know? And if you cannot answer that with some reasonable strength and accuracy, then I don't think you have been doing all that well. But of course, it is the essence of the esoteric tradition that we can know. That before we know, especially, it's quite all right to have an orderly worldview, a Weltanschauung, as the Germans call it, a Cosmoconception, as one of the Rosicrucian leaders called it. Yes, but that is a step somewhere. And steps are to be walked on and not to be fixated at. And so what we need to do is that these issues may be interesting, may be important. And I think it is important to have at any given point in our career, in our spiritual career, to have a worldview, a manner of dealing with life, which is both intellectually and spiritually sound. And perhaps you can add some physical to it too. I am not a very physical guy. I never exercised my body for any purpose, and I certainly not going to start at age 93, or things like that, because in a typical Gnostic way, things that are at least ostensibly purely physical, they put me off, because they strike me as materialism. So when you tell, well, for the next 20 years you have to eat nothing but spinach 4 times a week or something like that, these things sound like balderdash to me. And they probably sound like that because they are. So the thing is, go to the center. What do you call it when you throw darts into a, or whether when you have a goal that you shoot at, do have a goal. Do throw the dart until you hit the middle, but don't believe that these activities in themselves are going to save you, make you happy, make you godly, one thing or the other. Because these are all beginnings, they are steps toward the goal. You have to find ways in which you can relate to the deeper world, where you are as home in the world of the psyche as when you are in the physical world, and where you can, in that fashion, step by step, go closer and closer to transcendence, until you very honestly and without any pretension can say, yes, now I know something. And if it takes 90 years to do it, then live 90 years. What the heck, you can do it, I have. So the important thing is to keep moving in the direction of transcendence. So the esoteric tradition has a worldview. It can explain to you sometimes in considerable detail as to how you came here and things like that. But it does it, if it's properly done, if it's not just a misunderstood esotericism, because that's what happens. Oh, if you'll believe in this, you'll believe in reincarnation, you believe in karma, maybe you'll stop eating meat. And there are people who say that they eat chicken, but they don't eat meat. What's a chicken made out of? Is it made out of papier-mâché, you know, or what? It's a biological creature with bones on it and meat on it. But in any event, you know, that's just those are the weirdnesses of people. But the important issue is to keep in mind what you are up to. And what you are up to is you want to move toward the source of things. You want to not just have life by eating a diet or even by going to the doctor. You want to have life which is the life of life, which is the essence of things, which is that intangible and invisible substanceless substance which gives us existence, and which, with our cooperation and availing ourselves of learning and experience and teaching of a good nature where we can find it, will take us to the goal. With the goal being not only believing, not only doing, not only following rules, although all of these or many of these may be there and may be important. There are many things that we may have achieved in our life which, without some rules and some order and some helpful modalities, would not have happened. So there are many things around that help, but there is that which helps, and then there is that which does the trick, which takes you to the goal, which takes you past the great portals. And when you can thus proceed and dedicate your interest, your study, your activities, your recreations and so forth to the task of coming closer and closer to that mysterious, invisible, intangible something that chews away at your mind, at your soul right now. It says, I am here, come on, are you going to attend to me? If you do attend to me long enough and hard enough, then I will teach you how to know, and it will do so. I know it does that, and I have known those who have known in that fashion, and I have tried to do it myself. And so we are in a particularly difficult position, but there were others in history that were similar. I mean, there were not too many cosmological and moral rules that people were taught to observe, let's say, in ancient Rome. If you had the opportunity and if you had the money, you could do most anything. And if you knew the Emperor Augustus, then he would make you a god or a goddess, because he had the power to do that. As I am not down on Rome. My father was the greatest admirer of Rome whom I ever knew, and we had all the books by the great Roman scholars, because it's an example of under various conditions what can happen to humanity. And so you can learn a great deal from that. But on the whole, this is the heart of the matter, the heart of the process is an internal process, which, however, needs external assistance to manifest and to move you along. So it's both inner and outer. Those are really one of the two alchemical manifestations of the two polarity, that which is within and that which is outside. And the time may come when that which is within has taken over to such an extent that when you look around, it is everywhere. Like some of the saints who were praying to another saint or to Jesus Christ, and then they looked around, and there were Christs all over the room, Christs standing shoulder to shoulder to each other, because that which really is, that which we can know, is ubiquitous, is everywhere, can everywhere be found, and when it is found, it will be victorious. So I hope that this sort of put our considerations into closer observation, because we may think that these are ultimate things, and they are not. If we are looking for the essence, then we can discover that essence while we are cooking on the stove. It was one of the great saints said that he had his greatest mystical experience of a monk, and he was employed in the kitchen of the monastery. It'll come to me which one it was. And then he said that his greatest experience came to him one time in the kitchen while he was cleaning fish. No, I tell you, that's a kind of a smelly operation and all that. And not everybody would do it. But if the consciousness is moving in the right direction, you may be doing anything outside, and it's going to happen inside. So let's be courageous, let's be persevering, because inside of us is the potential of great and wonderful and beautiful and good things. And if we strive for them mightily and ask for the help that always has been available to people like that, then indeed we shall know, we shall get to the goal, we shall enter our Father's house, as was said to us, to go out no more. Thanks very much.